Welcome to this explainer, folks. We are jumping right into a terrifying scientific reality today. We're going to unpack the hard data, the biology, and the history that prove a zombie apocalypse might actually be a whole lot more than just a Hollywood myth. Let's get into it.
So, could zombies actually exist? Look, we all know the pop culture tropes, right? We've played the video games, watched the movies, read the comic books. But if we put aside the fiction for a minute and look closely at real biology, evolutionary adaptations, and some seriously dark historical experiments, the answer to this question is a deeply disturbing yes. The biological mechanisms for a zombie-like outbreak already exist right now out in nature.
Think about the massive hit series, The Last of Us. Completely fictional? Sure. But it brilliantly grounded its apocalypse in a very real, very terrifying fungus called cordyceps. The creators didn't just invent this pathogen out of thin air. They simply scaled up its real-world horrors to target human beings instead of insects.
All right, part 1, parasites and fungi. To really understand how an outbreak could happen, we've got to step out of video game fiction and look at the microscopic threats already crawling around in the real world.
So, what are we dealing with? A parasite, by definition, needs a host body to survive. It extracts food and protection, usually while doing some serious harm to that host. But for a zombie scenario, we aren't looking at bloodborne illnesses like malaria. No, we are looking for neuroparasites. These are highly specialized organisms, specifically evolved to breach the blood-brain barrier, attack the nervous system, and literally seize physiological control.
A perfect real-world example of this is a little neuroparasite called Toxoplasma gondii. When this guy infects a mouse, it doesn't just make the animal sick. It literally rewires the mouse's nervous system. By manipulating neurotransmitters like dopamine, it completely blinds the mouse to reality, removing its natural fear of feline predators. It turns off the host's most basic survival instinct, making the mouse walk right up to a cat just so the parasite can be consumed and reach its final host.
Imagine for a second if a parasite like this evolved to actively target and manipulate us. What if, instead of just removing a fear of cats, it completely shut down our cognitive reasoning? What if it rewired us into aggressive predators whose only biological drive was to violently spread the infection to others?
Which brings us right back to the cordyceps fungus. It already achieves this exact neurohijacking in ants. It forces the infected ant to climb up to a high vantage point, lock its jaws onto a leaf in a literal death grip, and fully zombifies the insect so the fungus can burst from its head and spread its spores. But thankfully, humans have a powerful natural defense system. Our internal body heat is just too hot. We are literally too hot for this fungus to survive inside our biology.
But here is the massive, terrifying what-if that evolutionary scientists are warning us about. As climate change steadily cranks up global temperatures, wild fungi are being forced to adapt to warmer and warmer environments. So what happens if cordyceps adapts to the heat and eventually learns to survive the internal temperature of the human brain? That's not science fiction, folks. It's just biological adaptation.
And that brings us to part 2, genetically modified viruses. Because nature is definitely scary enough on its own, but what happens when human curiosity gets involved in the lab? That's where things get incredibly precarious.
We regularly modify viruses in secure labs. Through processes like gain-of-function research, we take natural viruses, alter their genes, and sometimes make them far more transmissible to study them and create life-saving vaccines, just like we saw with the massive global effort for COVID-19. But there's a serious dark side here. If a genetically enhanced, highly contagious virus were to accidentally leak from one of these high-security facilities, the results could be absolute chaos.
To understand the sheer devastation of a mutated virus, just look at rabies. It starts off looking like a regular flu, but it slowly creeps up the peripheral nerves, and once it hits the central nervous system, the victim completely loses their mind to rage, severe hyperactivity, and this bizarre, debilitating fear of water. All logical behavioral control simply vanishes.
And tragically, we aren't talking about ancient history here. Rabies still kills roughly 59,000 people every single year. That is a staggering number of lives. This happens primarily in impoverished regions across Africa and Asia where life-saving post-exposure vaccines are either just way too expensive or completely unavailable to the people who desperately need them most.
Now combine those thoughts. If a rogue scientist in a lab were to intentionally splice genes to shorten the incubation period of rabies, make it highly contagious from human to human via saliva, and just dial up that aggression factor, you would essentially have a hyperviolent, real-life zombie virus spreading completely unchecked through the population.
But hey, we don't even need a lab-engineered pathogen or a mutated fungus to see zombie-like symptoms. Part 3. Brain diseases. Nature provides a tragic template right inside our own biology. When you actually map the symptoms of severe neurodegenerative diseases, the tragic medical reality closely and uncomfortably mirrors the traits of the undead. As amyloid plaques build up or misfolded proteins physically destroy the brain's delicate architecture, we see the heartbreak, the mindless shuffle, the complete loss of identity, and the severe inability to control bodily movements. The person they once were is simply gone. Which leads us to Part 4, undeniably the darkest chapter of this explainer. Dark human experiments. Because we haven't just theorized about playing God. There are historical moments where humanity actively tried to do it. Let's look back at the horrors of World War II. Facing a devastating loss of over 4 million soldiers, Nazi Germany's desperate generals and scientists asked a truly horrific scientific question to try and turn the tide of the conflict.
They didn't want to stop the war. They literally wanted to recycle their casualties. They actually attempted to resurrect fallen soldiers. They conducted unspeakable, fatal reanimation experiments on prisoners in concentration camps. Had these gruesome electrical and surgical trials somehow miraculously succeeded, they wouldn't have brought back the human soul. They would have created literal, unthinking biological weapons.
And when they realized they couldn't cheat death and bring back corpses, well, they quickly pivoted. They moved right to mind control. Using intense hallucinogenic drugs and severe electroshock therapy, they tried to completely strip away human free will and the ego itself, hoping to subjugate the living into an army of breathing subjects who could be directed without question. So, factoring all of this science and history in, we arrive at Part 5, Outbreak and Containment. If a mutated fungus, an engineered virus, or some dark lab experiment actually unleashes a pathogen today, how would the modern world handle it? Well, governments would immediately fall back on standard emergency public health laws. We're talking severe military quarantines, martial law, and massive isolation zones, much like the early desperate days of the COVID-19 lockdowns in China. The bureaucratic playbook is always strict containment first. But seriously, consider this. A standard respiratory virus spread globally despite our massive worldwide isolation efforts and heavily guarded borders. So how in the world do you possibly enforce a lockdown against an infected population that violently and actively attacks the very medical and military personnel trying to contain them?
Ultimately, the absolute biggest takeaway from this explainer is this. The real threat isn't the walking dead. It's the sheer unpredictability and hubris of human nature. The biology for a zombie-like virus already exists in parasites, fungi, and lab-altered pathogens. But at the end of the day, our biggest threat isn't nature. It's humanity's relentless scientific meddling and our utter inability to contain the consequences. So, if the outbreak starts tomorrow, are you truly prepared for who the real monster will be?